Hi, everyone, and welcome to this book launch for John Molyneux's new book, Dialectics of Art, hosted by Bookmarks Bookshop. My name is Joseph Chinara. I'm the editor of International Socialism, and I'll be hosting today's launch. Let me first of all say a little bit about John Molyneux. I've known John in person for about 20 years now, but I first met John long before that when, as a school kid in Bradford in the early 1990s, I used to read a column he wrote in Socialist Worker newspaper, which made such a big impression on me that I moved house a couple of years ago and I found a little collection of John's columns, which I'd cut out, annotated and stuffed into a box file. And I think in a real sense, it reflects the fact that John taught me and a lot of other people a great deal about how to make sense of the world. And I think in this book, what he does is he brings to bear this profound understanding of society and history on the topic of art, a topic he's been exploring for most of his life. It's a really magnificent work. John lives today in Ireland, where he's a member of People Before Profit and editor of Irish Marxist Review. And in a moment, John's going to guide us through a few of the key ideas in his book. Before he does that, let me introduce our other guests tonight. We have Nicola Field, who's a writer, artist, and socialist activist in South London. She is currently undertaking a PhD at Kingston University, and her research interests include queer sexuality and mental health, and her work involves text-based art, including video and ceramics. And we also have Alexandra Day, who's a leading member of People Before Profit, again in Ireland, and a member of the Socialist Workers Network in Ireland. They'll both be putting some questions to John later on, but you at home can also put your questions to us via social media, and we'll take as many of those questions as we can. So I'd like to now hand over to John, who's going to show us some images and talk us through, as I say, some of the key ideas in his book. Go ahead, John.
Thanks very much, Joseph, and many thanks to Bookmarks and Dave Gilchrist for putting this on, and to Joseph himself and for the kind introduction, actually, and to Nicola Field and Alexandra Day for joining us in this conversation. It's great to be involved. Seemed a good idea, since it's a book about art, to start by actually showing some pictures. And that's what I'll do. We start, of course, with the cover. The term dialectics, if we want to sum it in one line, is about how change occurs through contradiction. And the underlying theme of the book is how art over the last 500 years or so has developed in dialectical tension with the system, with capitalism. On the one hand, the ruling class, mostly the bourgeoisie during this period, rules the art world, controls it, just as it controls the culture as a whole, as expressed in Marx's famous aphorism, the ruling ideas of the age are the ideas of the ruling class. And so it controls the main museums and galleries and the main access points to art and the commissions and so on. But on the other hand, when we look at this history, we find that artists keep rebelling against it in one form or another. And I suppose that's how that tension works out. That is what I've above all tried to explore in the book. Tried to explore a lot of other things as well. But if I give my first example of this, I want to start with, as on the cover of the book, with Michelangelo's David. So if that can be right, thank you. Now, this was produced, of course, in Florence, as you see, 1501 to 4, and the Florence during most of the Renaissance was ruled by the Medici family, the famous bankers, and the Medicis were, of course, major patrons of the arts. And including of the young Michelangelo. But they were actually driven out of Florence by a popular revolt in 1494, and Michelangelo was commissioned by the Office of Public Works in Florence to produce a sculpture to commemorate this. And that is how we got the Michelangelo's David came to be. And it's often not mentioned in accounts of this, but of course, this is why it is David. David who slew Goliath. And Michelangelo, A, hated the Medicis, but B, was involved in various ways in rebellion against them. My second example is one of my other all-time favorite artists, Rembrandt, and is The Night Watch by Rembrandt. We can show that, please. Right, the full title of this is The Militia Company of Captain Hans Banning Koch, done in 1642. We've now moved on to the Dutch Republic, one of the first properly bourgeois societies, and the burghers or bourgeois of Amsterdam, where Rembrandt was working, really liked having their portraits painted. And they hired numerous artists, of whom Rembrandt was one of the most prominent to do this. And they particularly liked paintings of them parading as militia company in their militia companies. These militia companies had played an active role, an important role in the Dutch revolt that created the Dutch Republic, freeing it from the Habsburg Empire. But by the time we get to the 1640s, they were largely ceremonial, a certain kind of dad's army thing about them, about the, you know, they went on these ceremonial parades. The normal way in which they were painted would be as like a wedding photograph, with all the members of the company lined up so you could clearly see their faces one after another, or next to each other, and sort of all visible in a row. Rembrandt got the commission to paint this militia company, but did something completely different. It's an enormously greater painting. It's a kind of symphony in movement and color, but it was not kind of what he was supposed to do at all. And if you were one of the burghers who paid 100 guilders each for to have this painting, whose face was obscured by an outstretched arm or buried in the background, you were probably quite cross. So that's my second example. I don't think it wasn't a political protest by Rembrandt. I come to that. It's just that that's what he wanted to paint. My third example is a much more modern one, and that is from Tracy Emin, her now famous My Bed. This work, which caused a great deal of controversy when it came out, was it art or not, and so on. It was, in my view, clearly art. We'll come back to that, and it was a construction. It was a made work, and actually lift her bed and carry it into the museum. But that's beside the point. The main point is that she used this as a visual metaphor, and particularly the detritus surrounding the bed, you know, the used condoms, the bottles, or all the rest of the stuff. And she used it really to take through the visual metaphor, to take the kind of terms of abuse directed at women so often, slag and slut, and defiantly hurl them back at us, the audience. Okay, now those are just some examples. I could give 100 examples of this, you know, through Goya, through all sorts of different people, through the surrealists and so on. But the point I want to make, and that I explore in the book, is that this rebellion doesn't just derive from the fact that a lot of artists are left-wing or rebels of one kind as themselves. It's rooted in a contradiction between capitalist production and artistic production. If we could show, you know, the Mona Lisa now, please, the next one. So that I argue that whereas under capitalism, most human labor is reduced to the status of being an appendage to the machine, capitalism tends to take away from labor any enjoyment or charm in the work, reduce it to an activity that is damaging for people. Capitalism is based on what Marx called alienated labor. In contradiction to this, I believe art is an expression of creative labor, labor that the artists themselves controls the production. Often they have to sell their work. They have no choice but to sell their work and commodify it, but they control the actual process. And this leads me then to an attempt to work out, if you like, a definition of art, a conceptualization of what art is, that will range from looking at from the Mona Lisa, I suppose the single most famous painting, through to the next one, which is by Marcel Duchamp. Marcel Duchamp's Mona Lisa, actually based on a very cheap reproduction with a moustache attached and the slightly the racy title of LHOOQ, which said a certain way means she had a hot ass. Or this one, the next one, please, by Carl Andre, another kind of art scandal known as the bricks in the Tate, equivalent 8. I just go with these three examples in the sense that I was trying to solve the problem. Are they all art? What makes them all art? What makes the difference between work that is art? You know, when are bricks art and when are they not? Etc., etc. And the argument I make there is that the key factor, it's not the whole of the argument, I haven't got time for that, but the key factor is that they're produced by labor that is under the control of the artist, and that the artist produces a work which tries to unite its form and content. Another question, related question that I address in the book is how we judge art. How do we decide whether art is good or not? This is a different question from whether it is art. You can have mediocre art, you can have great art, but how do we make a decision between what is good, what is excellent, what is great art? And here, first of all, I run through the criteria that have been used. Actually, before that, I look at how that judgment gets made and who makes it, the mechanisms and so on. But then I examine the criteria that have been used over the centuries. Things like skill in imitating nature. Things like the notion of beauty. Beauty as harmony, beauty as the sublime. Expressive power of art. How innovative or original it is, and so on. I go through all those and show how they can be used to make judgments. If we can look at our next one, please. The Rubens. And so how you could compare this painting, say, by Rubens, and I'll take a similar subject. You know, this is a landscape going into the distance, and I compare it with a similar subject, which is Hockney's Garrowby Hill. We can show that. Can you make a judgment between these two? And I argue that using these criteria, an amalgam of the criteria that have been developed over the centuries, you can, and that the Rubens, if we go back to it, the Rubens emerges as a much greater work than the Hockney. Again, example, I explore lots of examples in the book. But then I also ask, does Marxism add to this? And I stress add. I'm not saying any of these other criteria are of no validity, whether it's beautiful or not, whether it's well painted, how much skill has gone into it, how emotionally it moves you, all of those are relevant. But I argue that Marxism does add something to this. What it adds to it is an understanding that art, as part of, if you like, the superstructure of society, arising on the foundation of its relations of production and other social relations, that what distinguishes great art is its insight to and expression of social relations, especially changing social relations. And I think personally that this works not just for visual art, I think it works for Shakespeare or Samuel Beckett or great music, or, you know, I think it works for Louis Armstrong and Billie Holiday and The Clash and Bob Dylan, all, I think it's worked. I think this is key to what they're doing, is that they give artistic expression to great social relations, to changing social relations between people. I don't just mean, workers and bosses and workers and so on, not just the fundamental relations of production, but all the social relations between people, like between lovers, between parents and children, between friends, between a king and his subjects, and so on. The multitude of social relations that make the web of life. I give you an example here then to try and show what I mean about how this affects our judgment of art. I want to show two pictures here, one by Lucian Freud and the other by Francis Bacon. The Lucian Freud, please. Now, Lucian Freud and Francis Bacon were friends. They were both leading artists in Britain at the same time and the same place, hanging around the bars of Soho and Fitzrovia and so on. And they are both very fine painters, and I've chosen two works that were done roughly at the same time to illustrate my point. The first is Girl with a White Dog by Lucian Freud. I mean, it's an extremely technically accomplished painting. It's a very fine painting. Then I show a similar time, Francis Bacon, his Screaming Pope. Actually, it was based on the painting by Velasquez, the portrait of what's his name, Pope Innocent X by Bacon, but I call it the Screaming Pope. If you take these two works, I would judge, and I'm not trying to impose these judgments, it's just a way of making the judgment, but I would judge Bacon to have produced the more powerful work and to be the greater artist generally. Why? Because I think he gives a more profound insight into the social relations of advanced capitalism, and in particular the alienation that is embedded there. And I think that once you start asking questions like what the Pope is screaming at, what's making the Pope scream, you get all sorts of interesting questions about the nature of our society, what was happening in history, and so on. Right, based on these ideas, I make a number of case studies. Actually, they were written usually in response to particular experiences or exhibitions and so on, but of Michelangelo, Rembrandt, Picasso, of the young British artists like Damien Hirst, of Tracy Emin, of, show the next slide, particularly mention here the Egyptian photographer Yasser Alwen. We could move on. There you go, of him. He's much less well known than the others, but in my opinion, a great photographer, and I worked with him in the early noughties. Of Andy Warhol, Pollock, Jackson Pollock, and so on. And then I move on to talking about how modern art has developed as a reflection and response to the development of modern capitalism, and particularly through the dynamics of its development through the 20th century, Picasso, on to more recently the social turn of relational art and so on, kind of thing that you see and hear. If we can look at the Jeremy Deller of Orgreave, like this, you see it as a picture, you'll see the photograph of what was actually a process. He recreated the epic Battle of Orgreave from the miners' strike as a work of art, or through the whole, I discuss a whole range of different things, right through to the role art played in the Occupy movement and so on. And finally, the book concludes with my prediction, estimation. I think at the time when I first wrote it was a prediction, I think it's already happening, that art will inevitably in the current period respond to reflect the huge ecological crisis that we're facing. I use the image of Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty from 1970. This was a response to the sort of first ecological movement, the moment associated with Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. But it's just a hypothetical example, really. This is in Utah Lake, Salt Lake in America. Rather extraordinary work, in my view. But I'm not here being prescriptive. I'm not saying people will do this instead of painting portraits or painting about their personal experiences or anything like that. I'm just saying that when you look at the history of art, you can go back to, the cave paintings of Chauvet or Lascaux, or you could look at Gainsborough in the 18th century, Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, or you could look at Constable or Turner, Constable, the Hay Wain, these famous, but they all reflect and are responses to changes in the relationships between human beings and nature. The caves of Lascaux are art which is based on a primitive communist classless society of hunters and gatherers and foragers who have an almost mystical relationship with the animals they hunt. Mr. and Mrs. Andrews by Gainsborough in the National Gallery is absolutely an expression of a period in which the land has become above all else private property, and so on. The Constable's Hay Wain is a romantic, if you like, idyll about an image of an imagined version of the countryside, just as society is British society is undergoing industrialization. And I think the current ecological crisis will inevitably produce a reaction in art. And you see it already. I saw that just recently there was an exhibition by Olafur Eliasson at the Serpentine. I couldn't get there, of course, on conditions of I couldn't get there in the conditions of COVID, but it was interesting. It was about the Earth's perspective, etc., etc. So that's where I finish, really. The last thing I would just say is that analyzing art is very interesting, and obviously I've spent quite a lot of time doing it, but the most important thing is probably to actually look at it. So I'll conclude with that. Thanks.
Thanks very much, John. And it's a great introduction. We're very lucky to have people from all around the world listening and watching, people from New York and Athens and many other places besides. So I'm going to take a couple of questions from Nicola and Alexandra first, but please do keep asking questions on the chat because we'll come to those soon. But if I can first turn to Nicola.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that. John, I'm really finding your book an exciting read and having a few light bulb moments, to be honest, about the context in which art is made and how it's judged and consumed in our society. And I was struck by the fact that you established that decisions about the big blockbuster exhibitions that, we come up at MoMA in New York and the Tate Galleries in London, these big blockbuster exhibitions, the decisions about who features in those and what happens when, we supposedly live in a social democracy, and we're often told that the consumer is king, but in fact millions of us that go to these exhibitions and spend money and flock to them have no say whatsoever in it. And you explain how actually these decisions in the art market are taken very anonymously and often in secret, and it's quite a mysterious kind of process, and it made me think it really reflects a lot of the other kind of secret aspects of this so-called democratic society that we live in. And I just wondered if you could say something about how this process has really intensified through capitalist development, and does it mean, as some might suggest, does it mean that all art and all cultural production in capitalism is contaminated by the drive for profit?
Right. So I respond straight away to that.
Yes, go ahead, John.
Yeah, it's a great question that raises a host of issues. Sorry about that, distracting noise appeared. The first thing I want to say is that I think that Nicola's question relates to very fundamental things about our society. If you were to go back to the Middle Ages or to the Renaissance, you could name the individuals who controlled the art world very easily. The Medicis, for example, or rival families, or a few popes who were probably also members of the Medici family in some cases. And it was kind of open. Similarly, the question of who held political power, the king, Henry VIII or whatever, held political power and power of life and death over everybody, the absolute monarchs and so on. But with capitalism and the development of a market society, the real holders of power become more and more mysterious and hidden behind the workings of the market. It becomes more and more anonymous. And I think this happens in the art world as well. But it is nonetheless a fact that behind these processes, there are usually extremely rich people. They're not often foregrounded, but if you go to any of the major galleries and look who the sponsors are, there's a list of the ruling classes. They provide the money and they ultimately decide it. Behind MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, there was a Rockefeller family. Through various mediations, some, a man called Alfred J. Barr, who was foregrounded as an independent, just aesthete who owns it, but they controlled it ultimately. Through to somebody like Larry Gagosian today, a sort of billionaire art collector. Saatchi played this role in Britain. And they're not answerable to the public. It's a complete illusion that the public make these decisions, and it makes a huge difference, who they show in the art gallery. This is true. Absolutely true. The only constraint on them really, though, is that they want and do need to try and engage with what they think is the best art of the time. In the late 19th century, the art world was controlled very much by what called the ancien regime, the old academic. It was called academic, didn't mean like university professors, but the old academies were very much linked to the aristocracy, and they got out of gear with art, and they ended up back in the wrong horse. They didn't appreciate the best art of the time was being produced by the Impressionists, the Post-Impressionists. And you had this period, when Van Gogh couldn't sell a single painting and so on. But they shifted after that to incorporate modern art and abstract art and all sorts of things. And they have taste makers who to tell them who are making the good art. And they go out and scout for it and so on. So it's an interesting process. Your question, does it mean that the art is all contaminated? I think it does, actually. I think it does contaminate and pollute the whole art world. And I think it affects, I do not mean by that it makes it impossible to produce good art. Miraculously, almost, human creativity, such a good art does emerge through all this and is often bought up. The Guggenheims or the Rockefellers or whoever it is, they buy up great art by Diego Rivera and then got upset when it had a picture of Lenin in it and so on. But they do buy up great art, and great art it emerges through the whole process. But it does contaminate it, and it also produced the horrible thing that when we talk about what is good art and what is great art and so on, it gets merged with how much is it worth. I mean, if you take I put up the Mona Lisa, or you take any of those great paintings, you have the horrible question, well, somebody wants to pay 200 million for them. Shouldn't that be spent on, hospitals and children's education? And it should be, it's an awful thing, but that is the circumstances in which art works in a capitalist society. And that fundamentally won't change until we get rid of capitalism. So that's a long answer, but interesting question.
Thanks, John. I want to turn now to Alexandra. You
Yeah,
go ahead.
thanks so much for that, John. I think your presentation, it really covers such a lot of ground, and yet it's still just a snippet of what the book has to offer. And I thought you raised a lot of very interesting questions, and certainly coming from studying art history in college, I think a lot of writers, at least in recent times, are almost allergic to making judgments about art in their writing. So I thought that was quite refreshing. But I thought a very interesting point that you brought up, and I think it was the one that stuck with me the most, is sort of this question of art as unalienated labor. And that sort of got me thinking about the question of arts and crafts, if you will. And I think you have a quote in from William Morris about how prior to industrial capitalism, craftspeople, for instance, couldn't help adding beauty to the things that they made. And it made me also think of the writer John Ruskin, who's also, I'm not saying he's a Marxist, but I think he could do with a Marxist appraisal perhaps. You know, he often wrote about, you know, making a tool of a worker or making a man of him, and the difference being allowing people to exercise their own creativity. So I think there's sort of a similar theme there. And that kind of, I'd like to hear more about your thoughts on what we might call explicitly crafts in that sense, because towards the end of the book, in particular, you talk about the sort of art based on participation. And I guess that got me thinking about, well, do things with a use value, for instance, a weaving or an embroidery or a quilt, are they art or are they not art because they have a use value? And I didn't get the impression in your book at all that what separates it is the decorative value. I mean, you just have to look at equivalent 8 and maybe that's not the most decorative work, but it got me thinking about, well, where does that difference, can it be located in this question? Because I don't think it's a matter of perhaps craft wanting to be elevated to the level of art, because I've seen that discussed a lot, and people saying, well, actually it should be hung in a gallery, because I don't think that's quite the answer. And it sort of poked at the question to me that the book, it covers a lot of ground, but also a lot of the examples come from that sort of Western canon and the Western tradition of art that we would maybe have studied more. And obviously I don't think it's the duty of any one book to cover the art of every corner of the world. But I think the question of crafts, when you look at maybe Native American arts, Japanese arts from across the global south, I think it brings up a bit of tension in that question of judgment, because how it expresses social relations, if it does or doesn't, is a bit, it requires a different way of looking at it, I feel. And I think that as well as that, I mean, I feel I'm raising a lot in this one question, but there's a gender dynamic to crafts, if you will, and there's a sort of a racial dynamic to it as well, which I think is important to address, because a lot of the creativity of people who wouldn't have access to being an artist full time is expressed that way. I'm thinking in particular of this group, the Cheese Bend quilters, who, you know, a lot of them had been slaves, and they made these incredible quilts during their being slaves and then during the civil rights movement. And it's quite impressive because they look like a Mondrian painting, really, and they were being made in this sort of very intense political climate. And yet they were also quilts to be used about the house. And I think you could apply a lot of the lenses that you use to judge art about the technical quality and et cetera, to these works, but they don't have a subject matter. So I was just interested in hearing sort of your thoughts about that, and maybe your thoughts about how we judge art of this nature, judge arts and crafts. So yeah, a lot of points raised there, but
Thanks, Alex.
Alex, very deep host of points there, and I will try my best without talking too long to respond to them. Right. The first thing I will say is that if we look at these distinctions that you get, first of all, as I was talking earlier, between art and non-art, how come some work produces art and some doesn't? And then you get these other distinctions like this is fine art, or this is design, or this is commercial art. You know, in one sense, Rembrandt was commercial artist. But, you know, get these distinctions. And crucially, art, the one that you raise, art and craft, they're all a product of history. You can't just answer them by saying, I think it should be so. There's these people who say it this way, but I have a different view. Those are things people say, but really you want to understand, you have to understand how the separations occurred. And the moment you do that, you see that the separation between art and craft, the idea that this is craft and that's art, the idea, for example, that one set of things are useful and the other are pure artist doesn't have a use value, and so on. That these derive from, again, very fundamental things in the way society has developed. So that the idea of art as being something separate from that which is useful, I think, is precisely a product of capitalism. It is not going to apply in the same way. And it isn't even true of capitalism, because, you know, an abstract painting on the board in the boardroom of a multinational corporation actually have a use value, albeit the use value is making them look good or making them look cultural and so on. You know, that kind of thing. So that it has a use value for them, or even just decorating a wall is a use value. So it has a use value, but it has the myth that it doesn't. So this is a product also very much of the division between manual and mental labor, which is central to class society. A division between the idea of some people do the work and other people do the creative planning, the organization of the work, etc. You know, that division between mental and manual labor is embodied, and of course it is gendered, and of course it is racial, and so on. The notion that craft is associated with the work of women, and the deeply embedded idea that women weren't really creative artists, that was very widespread. All of these things enmesh with one another, and they all increasingly challenged. And I think William Morris, who was influenced by Ruskin, of course, and so on, is very interesting figure on all this. I mean, there's a whole different discussion to be had about the role of what you might call medievalism in this, because you know, for Ruskin, for Morris, and for other people, they looked back to the pre-capitalist society. Morris came to understand that this was a pre-capitalist society. Many of them just thought they looked back to a purer, nicer world they saw in the pre-Raphaelites. Actually, the Middle Ages were not so nice. You went through the plague or whatever, but it was an idealized view. But I think there is some truth in the fact that production of the things of daily life had a more artistic quality in the Middle Ages and in other pre-capitalist societies and so on than it does in capitalist societies. So I think there's truth there. The point about exploring Western art, it's the art I grew up with and the art I know, and it is almost impossible, even if you want to, I think, to be on top of Indian art, Chinese art, African art, and all the rest of it. It's beyond, certainly beyond me and the circumstances I'm in, and so I'm cautious about it. But it is also an interesting development of the art market and the art world over the last 20 or 30 years, especially with the rise of China, that it is becoming increasingly globalized. And so those things are, those issues are being increasingly posed, as also the rise in women artists and the rise in artists of color inside the Western societies as well. But there's such a multitude of questions involved in that I better stop before we yeah, I'm seeing also lots of interesting questions appearing in the chat.
Thanks, John. Yeah, let's try and get in as many of those questions as we can. First of all, question from Breed Smith, who is joining us on Facebook, who says that you say in the book that we shouldn't judge art by political criteria or purely political criteria, but you're not saying that art isn't political. So can you say a little bit more about the relationship between art and politics?
Yeah.
So maybe if you try that one, John.
Yes, please. Yes, thanks. Look, first of all, I mean, you sometimes hear people say art is not really political, or it should be above politics, or leave politics out of art. It's like people say leave politics out of sport and so on. Such people just don't know anything of the history of art. I mean, I showed the Michelangelo David because it's such an iconic piece of work, but you go through the history of art and there is you know, an immense number of works of art that are directly political. Picasso's Guernica, for example, you know, the works of Goya, the Surrealists, beat the whites with the red wedge from the constructivists in Russia. Art is always extremely political, not always, but frequently extremely political. So that's the first thing that needs to be said about that. To say that you can't judge it by political criteria, the point I'm making here is that it certainly can't be done by mechanically. You can't simply say such and such an artist is progressive and therefore their work is good, or such and such an artist is reactionary and therefore their work is bad. It just doesn't work. I mean, famously with Marx himself, like, you know, greatly loved the work of the writer Balzac because he thought it gave great insights into the social relations of capitalist society developing in France and so on. But there are hundreds of examples. You can't look at Velasquez and say, well, the fact that he, you know, was a court painter for the Spanish monarchy who were utterly reactionary means that Velasquez wasn't a great painter. Francis Bacon, who I gave an example of, had the most horrible opinions. I mean, God knows what would happen. He would be cancelled left, right, and centre. I think if anybody listened to the sort of things he would say in the pub in Soho overnight, had obnoxious opinions, but a great artist, I think. So you can't do it in that mechanical way. What I do think, though, is interesting here is that the way in which, in a mediated way, politics affects art. I'll take a novel and then I'll relate this to painting. Imagine your view of women was crudely misogynistic and sexist. This would obviously affect a novelist's ability to write women characters, wouldn't it? Or in a play. So it is not just simply saying, I refused, this novel is bad because I know so-and-so is a sexist, but the fact that they were sexist and misogynist would affect the woman characters. And I think this happens in art all the time. So, for example, if you take Rubens and Rembrandt would be an example I would give here. Rubens was a painter of the counter-revolution. He was a great artist, immense amounts of skill. So, a painter of the counter-revolution. Then compare with Rembrandt. They all painted, Rubens and Rembrandt, like many other artists, Velasquez, Titian, so other great artists, painted nudes. But when you look at a painting like Bathsheba by Rembrandt, it comes from a different view of women, and that shows in the painting. And it produces a greater painting than in the Rubens. I'm not saying Rubens is not good, but it does produce a greater painting. And so I think that the mediated politics, and it isn't necessarily a question of whether the person is right-wing or left-wing, but of their insights, does make a big difference in the judgment of art. Can I just say on this, I saw a question appear from somebody about why make judgments about art? And that is discussed in the book. And I think I just want to say on this that all the society has no option. I think as individuals we do make judgments, but society has no option because there's far more work produced than you can preserve, and decisions get made about what will appear in the gallery, what won't, what will appear in the museum, what won't, what will be in the books, what won't be, what will appear in the main square and what won't be. So it becomes an inescapable thing that we do make such judgments. So just add that in there.
Thanks, John. Okay. There's a question from Nick, who's also joining us on Facebook, who wants you to elaborate more on your definition of art, and says, you know, aren't the artists themselves alienated? So can you say a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Thanks. Yeah, that's an interesting question. That is actually discussed in some detail in the book, because when I first put forward this argument, I found that a lot of people misheard it as if I was claiming that artists aren't alienated, which is an absurd idea from a Marxist point of view. We're all affected by alienation. We're all alienated. And I didn't mean that at all. But I heard a lot of people heard it as that, as if artists were some special breed of people. You know, maybe they didn't eat food. Maybe they weren't screwed up by their parents. Maybe they were, I don't know. But of course artists suffer from alienation. And it is extremely clear in the lives of many, many artists. No, that's not what I mean. It is about saying that there is a difference in the nature of the labor that produces art. And again, this is not an ahistorical thing. It emerges in tension with, in opposition to, the transformation of labor into a commodity that is foundational of capitalism. And then it's the development of capitalist production. It's what the difference is, and it's a simple thing. It's not a mysterious thing. It is that artists need to control their work. I mean, imagine, I give you a contemporary example. Imagine you're Ken Loach and you want to make a film, right? You have to have all sorts of dealings with all sorts of capitalists and capitalist institutions. But the one thing that is crucial is that Ken Loach and the people he works with collectively, control what they produce. Otherwise, you'd never get Land and Freedom. You'd never have got Bread and Roses. You know, because the whole point is that he, Ken Loach, and the people he works with, in this sense, control what they're doing. And it is the same, I think, you know, with Michelangelo, or it is the same with Tracy Emin, even if she has become a Tory. So it is that you control what you produce. You often have to sell it afterwards. That the general condition of artists, they have to sell their work to survive and make a living, but they control it in a way that is different from when you just simply sell your labor power to an employer who then determines what you do. So that's the distinction I'm making. And I just add to it, because I saw it as a question, and I'll add to it. How does this relate to scientific work and so on? I think there's lots of forms of non-alienated labor that take place under capitalism. You know, producing revolutionary or Marxist theory is an example of that, or being you know, often games people play or work in their garden, all sorts of things. The difference about art, and science is an example, the difference in art is that it's non-alienated labor that strives to produce things which unite form and content and are presented to involve a worldview that is united. What I mean by united in form and content, I mean if you're doing a painting or a poem, every word counts and the order of the words count, the form counts. And the same with a work of art. You know, every brushstroke, every arrangement counts. Okay.
Thanks, John. Yes, and I found the opening chapter of the book really interesting in clarifying those points and arguments. I'm going to ask a couple of quick questions from people that have come up. There's a question from Peter, who asks, must great artists always be outsiders of some kind? And there's a much more specific question from Tim Sanders. What do you think of Picasso's comment when he saw the Lascaux paintings? We have learned nothing. Even if the quote is apocryphal, it raises some interesting questions. So let me put those two to you, John, if that's okay.
Welcome. No, the first one to Peter is no, they don't have to be outsiders. The view of the artist as necessarily an outsider, like the questions of craft and so on, is a historical moment. It's based on what I would call the moment of Van Gogh. At that point in time, because of this contradiction between the way art developed and the control of art by the old aristocracy, really, artists became complete outsiders. And the famous phrase by Clement Greenberg there, he said that they migrated to Bohemia, quite literally, to Montmartre or the south of France or whatever, so you'd have Toulouse-Lautrec in the Moulin Rouge and so on. But this is not the way it always has been or always is. I mean, this certainly wasn't so beforehand. Michelangelo wasn't an outsider, really. He was lauded as the divine Michelangelo, and the popes came to him to make work for them. Rubens, who I mentioned earlier, was a painter to the aristocracy of Europe, joined the counter-revolution really against the Protestant Reformation, and retired as a millionaire, or whatever the equivalent was then. Rembrandt went through being both a society painter and a bit of an outsider later in his life. It varies. And in the 20th century, I don't think you could call Picasso an outsider. He may have started that way, but then he becomes a multimillionaire and one of the most famous celebrities in the world. And today, there are many, many artists who are completely insiders. And you get the phenomenon of people who, they come up from below and then are incorporated. Many of the artists who appeared to be rebels when they did the Young British Art Show, the Sensation, which is reviewed in the book, find that they are completely incorporated. You can do a list of how many of them became royal members of the Royal Academy, including Tracy Emin, and how many of them became got OBEs and CBEs and all this. So there's all these are historical products. The other question, the Picasso quote from Lascaux, I know the quote, whether it's apocryphal or not. Now it goes hand in hand with one another quote from Picasso, which I often like, which is, that by the age of 12, I could draw like Raphael. I spent the rest of my life trying to draw like a child, which I think is a lovely quote. Have we learned anything since Lascaux? But if you look at they're absolutely magnificent. Again, there's a whole section of the book that discusses, has there been progress in art? And the conclusion I draw from this on this question, which I haven't got time to go into all the reasoning behind it now, but what I say is that there has been periods of progress and also periods of regression. But because art is a reflection above all and a response above all to social relations, it's not the same as as development of the forces of production. It's not the same as progress in material wealth. Now, if you look at the social relations of society, they have in one respect gone backwards since the time of the caves of Lascaux, in the sense that you had a classless society then. And if you look at the relations of production of modern capitalism compared to those of the Middle Ages, they are both a step forward and a step back. They allow greater scope for individual freedom in some respect, but they produce even wider inequality, and they're now threatening the whole future of humanity. So it's not a simple question. So some things have been learned since Glasgow and some things have been lost is my answer to that question.
It's very, very dialectical, John. I've got a question from Marnie Holborough, who says, what does the seer, or the audience, bring to art? Won't every work be interpreted differently depending on their own social position?
Yes. And I think all these questions, I keep saying this, but I think they relate to more than just art. They're actually quite important philosophical questions. I think that all knowledge is a relationship between the knower and the known. It has a subjective and an objective element in it, because everything we know about the world, everything we engage with, we see from a point of view. So I think that this is true. And I think that there is continual shifts historically in the way works are interpreted and what they mean. But I do not mean by this that everything is purely subjective. You can take that element of truth, and as with the question of objective truth about the world or all sorts of things, you can then turn this into a kind of postmodernist notion that, well, there is no objective truth, it's all just a matter of, which is really just a rehashed version of, everything is down to the individual, or, it's all just a matter of personal opinion and so on. So there's an element of truth in it, but it's not the whole story. Who is looking at art, who it's made for, the viewer, is very, very important. And indeed, this also relates to the development of relational art, which I think has had a lot of important and progressive elements in it, whereby the viewer of the art participates is induced into participation in the work in a way that, in a sense, completes that work. One of the best examples I sort of seen of this was done by a young Portsmouth artist, Nicola will remember, Roxanne Chapel, that was shown in the Left in Vision exhibition that we put on. She didn't go on to become a professional artist, which was a pity, but it was about the experience of for a young single mother dealing with the benefits system, and she created a benefits office, and you participated in that, going through that and what she went through from her own personal experience. But you were induced into participating in this, and your participation became parts of the work. And this was a very interesting idea. It's often been put to rather bland uses in current art, but I think it's an important critical idea. So Marnie's question's very interesting there.
Thanks, John. I think Nicola wanted to ask a final question, which is a good one for us to wrap up on. So go ahead, Nicola.
Thank you. It's been a fantastic event. So in your discussion about alienated labour and non-alienated labour, John, you call on Marx's kind of concept of spiritual labour, and you describe art as a kind of spiritual health food, and that really speaks to me as a practitioner. I feel like many people, I often feel alienated from others, from my life, myself. And that my practice really helps to remind me who I am, brings me back to myself, and helps me to kind of integrate so that I can express what's going on for me. And you describe how in a socialist society, creative work, creative labour won't be separate from productive labour anymore, that art and life can be integrated. And in fact, all work can have the potential dimension to be creative. And And so therefore the alienation that we experience from the products of our labours or the end results of our labours, is going to be healed, perhaps. And it's made me think, one of the central planks of mental distress in our society is that alienation. I certainly experience it myself, and it's part of the production process. And I just wondered what you might say. We have a kind of soul-destroying production process in our current society. What could be a soul-building process in a socialist society?
Go ahead, John.
Right. And we're coming to an end now, are we, Joseph? Shall I make this?
Yeah, I think let's have you come back on this, and then I think we'll take a brief comment from Alex, and then we'll wrap up there. And sorry to all those people who haven't brought in, who asked questions. There's a lot of you, but go ahead, John.
Okay. I just want to say that there's quite a lot of questions of the kind of what about nature, and I always find this when I talk about art, it is impossible to mention the artist that everybody wants to be discussed, or whatever, or that they're interested in, or what about music, or what about theatre, or what you can't do it in any talk. You can't do it in well, I suppose you'd do it if you did 100 talks, but quite a lot of those things are actually discussed in the book. I want to say that I think that, like this question that Nicola is asking, which I'm going to come on to, quite a lot of what is said does carry across to other forms of art, but not all of it. A lot of Marxist discussion of art takes its starting point literature as the central art form, Lukács and the novel and all this sort of thing. And there are significant differences when you come to visual art, painting and sculpture and so on, from the history of literature. The whole question of realism applies differently and so on. But there is a lot of carryover, I think. And I think essentially when I was trying to understand what art was, I was looking at across the board, although it's mainly applied in relation to art. Now, the question of kind of art as health food, as it were, I do think art is useful and necessary. I think it plays a very necessary role in our society. I think it's interesting that if you look at all great Marxist revolutionaries, of course, this was not their priority. Their priority was making the revolution, whether it was Marx or Engels or Lenin or Trotsky or Rosa Luxemburg, Gramsci and so on, but they were all interested in art. Trotsky famously used to read the French novel while he was sitting in meetings of the Politburo. I think it's partly because this was Stalinism was setting in. I don't think he was doing that in October 1917. But I mean, they were all very, very interested in art and wrote about it at various times. And you ask why? It's not because it's terribly useful in the revolution in a straightforward way. It plays a role, but it's not that. It is also in a kind of, it's an inadequate analogy, but in the same way that we need food, or you need health, or you need exercise, or whatever, and it kind of works to enlarge and develop the human personality and increase our general understanding of our relations with fellow beings. Now, okay, now come back directly to Nicola's question. We are faced with a whole series of separations, divisions, and antagonisms that have developed out of capitalism. One of which, of course, is the metabolic rift that Marx identified, and John Bellamy Foster, Ian Angus, and others have worked on, between society and nature opened up by capitalism that's having such catastrophic consequences. Alienation is, central to this. In the economic and philosophic manuscripts, which is probably one of the works I've been most influenced by in relation to art and in politics, the Marx talks about how we become alienated. In becoming alienated from the labor, in the labor process, that is separated from our labor, this results in us being alienated from the products of our labor. That becomes something over and against us. And we become alienated from other human beings, from our species being, and we become alienated from ourselves. All of these alienations occur. And it is, I think, a central task of the socialist revolution to overcome this by putting people, workers, in control of their labor, and therefore in control, we call it workers' control of production. And to get workers' control of production, you need workers' control of the state and so on, workers' power. But it is to put people back in control of their lives, their society, and so on. It was one of Marx's central insights that the whole of human history is nothing but the self-creation of human beings through labor on nature. He never loses sight of the fact that it's labor on nature. You work on nature to create the world. And this whole process is now alienated, fucked up, if you like, in this group. It's all become totally distorted. So art, the fact that art exists, useful, beautiful, wonderful as it may be, but the fact that it exists as something separate from work as a whole, something that only a few people, who Alex was saying about this earlier, they'd call themselves creatives, like they're different from the rest of us, is a product of the fact that what is creative about human beings, what defines people as human beings, has been turned into this horrible mechanical alienated labor, which is as true for white collar. It's true working on a production line in a car factory. It's true working, working as a laborer in a mine. But it's also true of white collar work. It's also true of metal work that it becomes like this. And I think it is a fundamental goal of socialism, communism, and so on to heal that rift. And then what I think will also become the case, I think that the making of our world will become a collective product, which will be both productive and artistic. I have no idea what decisions people will make and what they will do, but I just try to give an example of what I mean. This Marx talks in the German ideology about overcoming the division of labor so that people be a painter in the morning, a shepherd in the afternoon, or whatever. I don't think it'll be quite like that, but I do think, let's take the question of building the houses, the homes we live in. Currently, you have different groups of people who perform different roles. For ordinary people, the primary role, there's some developer or a city council or someone who decides to build an estate. Then you have an architect who takes what it looked like. Then you have building workers who construct the thing, and then you have people who live in it. I think the way we live will be decided by a collective of people who include the people who will live in the homes, the people who will make the homes, the people who will design them. Won't be three different sets of people. Everybody will be involved in the process. It'll become a collective process. And insofar as architecture is an art, that will be part of it. And insofar as decoration is an art, that will become part of it. And I think that will apply not just to house building, but to all sorts of aspects of our daily lives and the world that we create through our interaction with nature. And your phrase, Nicola, there, that this will be spiritual health food or social production, I think, that when human beings control society and their work, and the two go together, all sorts of possibilities will open up. I don't think you can't specify what it will be, but I think it will be a whole new, the beginning of real human history, to paraphrase Marx again. Okay.
Thank you so much, John, and thanks for taking the time to answer all the questions that have come in. I'll just bring Alex in briefly for a final comment, and then I think we'll wrap up.
Yes, thank you so much for that, John, and thanks to Nicola, Joe. I've really enjoyed taking part in this event, and all the questions that have come in have been really interesting. And I have to say, like, from reading the book, I strongly recommend that you go and read it, because a lot of them are addressed in there, and it covers so much ground that has barely been touched on here. So, I mean, particularly, I enjoyed the chapter on Yasser Alwan, an artist I've never heard of before, to be frank. So I've learned a lot from it. And I think the discussion and your final comments there, John, it really shows about how I think art, it's not sort of an interesting side part that we might just consider and ask sort of interesting questions about for our own enjoyment, but it has that real transformative power and the real, it's an important question for socialists to take up, I think, and I think a very fulfilling one too. So, I mean, yeah, and your predictions at the end of the book, I think, are, fascinating about where art could go in response to the climate sort of situation. So, yeah, I mean, all I have to say is I really think everyone should get reading this book, get yourself a copy. It's a wonderful book. So thanks again to everyone.
Thanks, Alex. And I hope you've enjoyed watching and taking part in this discussion. Thanks to John, to Nicola, to Alex for their participation. Thanks to Bookmarks for hosting. If you want to get the book in Ireland, contact Rebel Books. It's €15, I believe. Anywhere else in the world, Bookmarks will supply you a copy for £15. I hope lots of people are going to get copies in their stockings. It's for Christmas. It's a wonderful, wonderful read. And to all you at home, stay safe, stay radical. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed tonight's meeting. Goodbye.